Hello everyone. Today we are going to see how to install Raspberry Pi OS on the Raspberry Pi. It doesn't matter if you are using Raspberry Pi 3 or 4. The process remains the same. Raspberry Pi OS is officially supported operating system for Raspberry Pi. If you check Raspberry Pi website, it offers 3 flavors of Raspberry Pi OS. Lite is a minimal version of Raspberry Pi OS without a graphical user interface. If you want to set up a headless Raspberry Pi to use it as a NAS server, a media server, a VPN server, or anything that doesn't require graphical user interface, Raspberry Pi OS Lite is the right choice. So, let's get started. Now, take a look at what we need for this setup. You require a Raspberry Pi 3 or 4, an SD card with 16 GB or higher capacity, Raspberry Pi Imager software, which we'll be using to write the Raspberry Pi OS on SD card, a router with internet connection, Ethernet cable, PC with SD card reader. For this video, I am using Windows machine, but if you are working on Mac or Linux, the steps don't really change. You just have to use the respective version of the Raspberry Pi Imager. Now, take a look at what steps we will be following to install Raspberry Pi OS. These are just 5 steps for it. First, we will install the Imager software, then configure certain parameters for the OS and write it on SD card. Then start the Raspberry Pi and connect it via SSH. And lastly, we will update the OS. Now, let's check each step one by one. Our first step is to install Raspberry Pi Imager. For that, go to Google, search for Raspberry Pi Imager, select result from raspberrypi.com, download the software, install it, and run the Imager. Our step 2 is to configure the Raspberry Pi OS options and write it on SD card. First, you have to put your SD card into SD card reader of your computer and then go to Raspberry Pi Imager and click on Choose OS. You can see there are multiple options to choose, but for Raspberry Pi Lite, you have to choose Raspberry Pi OS Other and then Raspberry Pi OS Lite. Now type Ctrl-Shift-X to get the advanced options. You can ignore the first option as we are going to use the headless Raspberry Pi. Change the hostname if you want. Enable SSH and set the password for the Pi user. You can also configure Wi-Fi if you wish. Select the time zone. And as you can select these options and click on Save. Now, click on Choose the storage and select your SD card. Make sure you don't have any important data into this SD card as it will format it. Click on Write. It will give you a warning that SD card will be erased. And wait till it completes the write operation. Once done, you will see this message. Click on Continue. If you got any message to format, just cancel it and you are done. Step 3 is to start the Raspberry Pi. Now remove the SD card from the SD card reader of your computer and put it into Raspberry Pi. Connect the Raspberry Pi to your internet router using Ethernet cable. Connect the Raspberry Pi to power supply and switch it on. Step 4 is to connect the Raspberry Pi via SSH. But for that, first you need to know the IP address of your Raspberry Pi. To find it, use any IP scanner software. Here, I am using Advanced IP Scanner. You have to provide your local IP address range and click on Scan. You should see one entry with Raspberry Pi Foundation as a manufacturer. Note down the IP address for that entry. Now open the command prompt and type ssh space pi @ IP address you got from IP scanner. Type yes here. And now type the password of the Pi user you had chosen in step 2. Now you are connected to Raspberry Pi via SSH. Our last step is to update the OS. For that, type sudo apt update. This will update the list of packages for upgrades. And now you have to type sudo apt full-upgrade. This will download and apply available updates and also picks up any dependency changes. Choose Y here. Please note that for any future upgrades, better to use sudo apt upgrade instead of full upgrade. And that's all. Congratulations! You have completed all steps to install Raspberry Pi OS Lite on the Raspberry Pi. Thanks for watching.